You are listening to By the Book, because if you don't look at the world through the Bible, you will never see it right.
Welcome to episode 42 of By the Book. This is Alan Griffith, your host, and I am, as always, glad that you're listening today. We've been talking about the fact that God demands purity, and we have identified the fact that God is in charge. Some people don't like God. They don't like what God says. They don't like what God requires, but God is the creator. God is the judge. God is the one who says what is right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what's pure, what's impure. And the best thing you and I can do is bow before him and submit ourselves to him because someday we're going to answer to him. Now, we've been talking about impurity. We've been talking specifically about impurity with the rejection of God's natural order. We've been talking about transgenderism a little bit. We're going to get back to that and talk about it some more. But we got into this discussion by going to Genesis, talking about Lot, the nephew of Abraham, the sin that he witnessed in the city of Sodom, and then the judgment of God that fell because Sodom was made up of a multitude of people who were involved in homosexuality, and they were aggressive. When two angels went to that city with a view toward judging it, the men of the city gathered around Lot's house, and they wanted to take those men and homosexually rape them. It's just as clear as can be. We found some follow-up references to Sodom and Gomorrah in 2 Peter and also in Jude. And now we have moved over to Romans chapter 1, where Sodom and Gomorrah are not mentioned, but the Apostle Paul is going to lead us through the experience of mankind rejecting God and what happens to a society when they do reject God. And a part of that is going to be the tragic, horrible sin of homosexuality. Last time, as we closed, I read verse 18 of chapter 1. And I would invite you to open your Bible because Paul, in this book of Romans, gives a whole thesis on Christianity. It's a tremendous book. Everybody should read it. And it will tell you the story of man's sin, but also the wonderful story of God's salvation. Well, in Romans 1, Paul's going to begin his message of the book talking about sin. And we read verse 18 last time, and I want to read that again as we get started here today. In verse 18, Paul said, "For the wrath of God." Now that term wrath implies the judgment of God. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. There's a place called heaven. God has established a place to manifest his presence in heaven. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. There's a lot of ungodliness today. Ungodliness is when people simply reject God. They might reject the existence of God. There's a growing number of atheists in this country, and they're just going to deny that God even exists. And there are those who are agnostic, and they claim they don't know whether God exists. Well, the truth is, everybody knows that God exists. So when there is ungodliness, when people say, I don't believe in God, or I want no part of God, or I'm not going to submit to God, I'm not willing for God to have his way in my life, that's going to bring the judgment of God. The time will come when God is going to judge ungodliness. The wrath of God is also revealed against unrighteousness. To be righteous means you do what's right. To be unrighteous means you refuse to do what's right. Now, I've often pointed out sometimes it's hard to know what is right in life, but when you know what is right, you need to do it. And the way you measure right and wrong, as we've pointed out many times, is by the book I hold in my hand, the Bible. If you want to know right and wrong, good, bad, true, false, whatever, go to this book. But there are many who are unrighteous. They're doing the wrong thing. They're doing what is right in their own eyes, ignoring what God says is right, doing what God says is wrong. And God says, well, judgment's coming. And it's going to come on those who hold the truth in unrighteousness. The term hold there means to suppress, to hold it down. There are those who are suppressing truth that they know, and the Bible's going to point that out. Truth that they know, but they are suppressing it. They're not going to let it have its way in their lives. And they are suppressing that truth in unrighteousness. They don't want to face the truth because they want to do what they know is wrong. You see, if you admit there is a God in heaven and that someday we're going to answer to him, then it'll cause you to do some thinking about how you're living. But if you reject God and you deny God, you reject that truth, then you will go ahead into your unrighteousness, and you will eventually do it without guilt because your conscience will be destroyed and you will persist into greater and greater sin. Now, verse 19 says this, because. So let's go back and see what we're saying here, what Paul's saying. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and all of the unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because, here's why, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. Now, you know, there are a lot of people in the world who have never seen a Bible, they have never heard it preached, and they don't worship the true God. And there are some people who would say, well, how are they supposed to know about God? And here's what Paul says. God is going to judge because there is truth that is manifest to all people. It's truth that is known and has been made known to all people. And it's the truth, we'll see more about it in a moment, the truth of the existence and the power of God. In other words, this is what the text is going to tell us. Nobody has an excuse for rejecting God. Verse 19 says, again, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. Nobody will ever be able to stand before God and say, well, I didn't even know you exist. God's going to say, no, you did know I exist because I showed it to you. You refused it. You rejected my message. Verse 20. For the invisible things of him. God is invisible. And there are many, many things that God has created that you and I have never seen. Someday we will. But there is a whole realm of heavenly things. There's a whole angelic host. There's so much of the spiritual kingdom. God says, however, that the invisible things of him, the things that you could not see with your eyes, it says, from the creation of the world are clearly seen. Now, that's not a time word. That doesn't mean from way back when things were created. It means this, on the basis of the creation of the world. Now, you and I can't see God, But you and I can see the work of God. You and I can see his creation. You and I can see much of the earth on which we live. You and I can look into the heavens. We can see the sun and the moon and the stars. And we can see the work of his hands on earth in terms of humanity and the animal kingdom and all the trees and the flowers and the rivers and the oceans and whatever. And here's what Paul is telling us. Here's what God is telling us through Paul. He's saying, when you look at the world, when you look at the universe, you should recognize that it did not come into existence by itself. It is not eternal. It has been created. It has been made by someone, and that someone is God. Nobody will ever get away with denying the existence of God. That's why back in the Old Testament, in book of Proverbs, it says, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. The rejection of God is always a heart matter. It is not a matter of the mind, because to believe in God is rational. A thinking person will believe in God. So when somebody denies God and they say there is no God, it's the problem with their heart. They know, but they refuse the truth. And so we're back here at verse 20. Paul says, the invisible things of him from, or on the basis of the creation of the world, the idea being you look at the world and you will understand the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are, listen to it, clearly seen. Clearly seen. Nobody has an excuse. Everybody can see it. It goes on and says this, being understood. You meet an atheist who is going to be aggressive in his denial of God. He's going to make fun of you if you believe in God. He's going to try to give you all kinds of reasons to reject God. And then God says, well, I want to tell you something. The truth about me is clearly seen by that atheist. He rejects it. He's holding it down. He is suppressing it. But that atheist understands. He understands. What does he understand? Well, it says the invisible things of him, of God, on the basis of the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. That's interesting. The fact that God is the creator is clearly seen and understood by those that he has created. Now, I don't know about you today as you listen to this podcast, and you might be sitting there as a doubter. And if so, I'm glad you're listening. But I want to tell you, based on the Bible, you know there is a God. You know that he is the creator. Listen as verse 20 goes on, because it's a powerful statement. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. The eternal power of God is known by somebody who simply observes the creation that God has made. You look at that sun, 93 million miles away. You look at those stars, so many more million miles away. You look at that moon as it encircles the earth. You look at what God has done, and you are going to recognize, if you're honest, you're going to recognize there had to be someone of eternal power who made that. It didn't just come about. It has not always existed. There was a time when there was nothing and nobody but God, and God then created, and everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. The guy in the city knows it. The guy who is far around the world, who has never heard the Bible preached, knows it. Everybody knows this truth, the eternal power, and then the Godhead of God. In other words, the idea that, yes, there is a God. Everybody knows it. And so Paul concludes verse 20 with this, so that they are without excuse. No excuse. So you meet the atheist. You meet the one who mocks God. You can tell him right to his face, there is a God, and you know it. And there is no excuse for your atheism. There is no excuse for your agnosticism. There is no excuse, and the wrath of God is revealed against you because you know the truth and you are suppressing the truth. You're holding it down. And again, why? Because if you know the truth of God and you recognize his eternal power, and you recognize that since he created you, you are answerable to him. If you know those truths, then it's going to change the way you live. It's going to affect the way you live. If a man really believes, when I die, I'm going to stand before my Creator, that'll give you a whole lot of thought about how you ought to live. And you'll want to find out more about God and find out how he wants you to live. But you see, Romans 1 is about a world that is in rejection of God. And Romans 1 is telling us what happens to people, what happens to a society, what happens to a culture when they reject God. And I'll tell you what's concerning about that is that you and I in this country are seeing people, many people, perhaps more and more, maybe most people, moving away from God, rejecting God, denying God, and our culture, our society, and the way it operates is reflecting that rejection of God. Now, verse 21. Verse 21 says, because they're without excuse, because that when they knew God, was there ever a time when the whole world knew God? And the answer is yes. Adam and Eve knew God. And you know what? They sinned. They rejected his authority in their life. And then the time came when God judged the whole world with the flood of Noah's day. And off of that ark that Noah built came Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives. 8 people came off that ark, and every single one of them, though it was a few, it was all the world, they knew God. And their descendants knew God, at least for a time. And then they moved into rejection. So verse 21 says, and here's the point, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. They knew God, and they didn't live for him. They didn't obey him. They did not honor him. They did not magnify him. They did not submit to him. They did not worship him. It says they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. They weren't thankful for God. They weren't thankful for what God did for them. You think of Adam and Eve, if you want to go all the way back to the beginning, God created them. God put them in the Garden of Eden. He blessed them incredibly. And when the time came that they were challenged by the devil, they turned on God. They rejected God. They rejected his word. They were not thankful for what God had done for them. They called his character into question, and thinking that God was withholding his best from them, they disobeyed his word and fell into sin and took the whole world with them. And then when you get to Noah and his family, they were not thankful. As a matter of fact, it wasn't too long after they came off the ark and people began to develop again that you got to the Tower of Babel just 100 years or so later. And there was no worship of God. There was no thanksgiving of God. They built the Tower of Babel, and it was an idolatrous practice that they had entered into. So there they were. They didn't glorify God. They should have. They were not thankful. And then it says in verse 21, but they became vain in their imaginations. Their imaginations are their thinking, their reasoning. I often talk about people today. Some people say they believe in God, but they believe in the God of their own imagination. They have their view of what they think God is like or what God ought to be like. And these people became vain. They became really idolatrous in their imaginations or their reasonings, and their foolish heart was darkened. They knew God. They turned away from God. And as soon as they turned away from God, they began to come under the great wickedness of sin. It affected their ability to give God thanks. It affected their ability to think right, to understand right. That's what this is talking about. Their imaginations were vain. Their heart was darkened. They couldn't see spiritual truth anymore. They were moving so rapidly in the wrong direction. And then verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Boy, I want to tell you what wickedness. They thought they were so wise. They thought they didn't need God. They thought they could handle things on their own. And you know what? They became fools. And I want to tell you something. That is exactly where we are today. We could go back and talk about the earliest days of this country. Certainly, not everybody knew God, but there was an honor given to God in the founding of the United States of America. But I want to tell you, professing themselves to be wise, the nation has become a nation of fools. Now listen to verse 23. Because this rejection of God moved them toward idolatry. And so verse 23 says, they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. When the world turned its back on God, you know what? It still worshiped. It still worshiped. It was still religious. They didn't worship the true and living God anymore, but they devised and created idols to worship. Idols of men. Or they worshiped the animals, the sacred cow, if you will. They worshiped different kinds of animals, the frog, the snail, the snake. They worship the mountains. They worship the volcanoes. They worship the rivers. They worship the sun. And so the world maintained itself as being religious. And we still, again, live in a very religious world. But they were worshiping the God of their own imagination. They were not worshiping the God of creation. They were not worshiping the God of the Bible. Now, you cannot reject God without paying a price for it. And so verse 24 says this, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. I want to tell you, that's a terrible judgment. Sometimes we talk about God is going to judge America, and He is. He is going to judge America. He's going to judge this whole world. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that God commands all men everywhere to repent because He has appointed a day when He is going to judge the world by the Lord Jesus Christ. Judgment is coming. It'll be a terrible judgment. But you know what? God judges in other ways. God sometimes says this to people. Is that the way you want to go? Is that the way you want to live? You want to turn away from me? You want to reject me? You want to do your own thing? Okay. I'm not going to convict you anymore. I'm not going to try to win you anymore. You have made your choice, and so I am going to give you up to your uncleanness. I want to tell you something. Again, people talk about God's going to judge America. I believe God is judging America. America, who again, in its founding documents and in the faith of so many of its founding people, had a respect and a love for God. Understanding, for instance, that our rights are God-given. They're given to us by our Creator. Government doesn't give us our rights. God gives us our rights. And government is supposed to simply protect those rights and secure those rights, because we're supposed to recognize that we are the creatures of God. But we turned away from that, and God has, I believe, said to this society, tragically, is that the way you want to go? Then you go ahead and go. And I want to tell you, when you reject God, you move into deeper and deeper and deeper sin. And that's where this country is going. I cannot believe where America is compared to what it was just 25 or 30 or 40 years ago. I certainly can't believe what America is compared to what it was when I grew up. And you might feel that way too. God gave them up to uncleanness. God said, you want to be unclean? And usually that term uncleanness speaks of sensuality and sexual sin, immorality, and so on. So God says, that's what you want? You want to turn away from me? Well, I'm going to give you up to your uncleanness. I'm going to give you up to your sensuality. And then it goes on and says, through the lusts of their own hearts. The heart, deepest part of man, deepest part of his being, the heart. When the heart turns against God, it develops lust. It develops desires that are ungodly and they're wicked. And God says in Romans 1, when you turn away from me and you develop your own idolatrous system of worship, then when you reject me, I'm going to turn away from you. And you want to go the way of sin? I'm going to give you over to your sin. You go ahead and go in that direction. But I'll tell you what, it'll come back to haunt you, and it's certainly haunting America today. He goes on and says this, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. To dishonor their own bodies between themselves. You know, some of the earliest wickedness that really, I hate to use the word blossomed, but blossomed in this country was when somehow it became okay to have intimacy before and outside of marriage. There was a time when there was a sacredness to virginity. Now virginity is mocked. Now virginity is made fun of. But there was a time when that was sacred. And for a young couple to get married and not have had relationships with all kinds of other people first used to be tragic. Now it's common. Well, God gave them up to that. Our society, I think, has been given up to that. They are dishonoring their own bodies between themselves. Now we're going to move to verse 25 next time we're together. And we're going to see that God is going to show us how the wickedness, the sinfulness of mankind, the sensuality that develops in mankind, eventually will develop all the way into that which is against nature, which is homosexuality. And then we may even talk next time about transgenderism. Folks, God demands purity. He demands it in my life. He demands it in your life. And there's going to be judgment when we reject purity and we reject God. We'll talk more about it next time. Lord bless you.